Good evening. Welcome. Please take your seats. We're about to get started. I'm Sebastian Burka. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Council. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have a great audience tonight to welcome Professor Paul Collier to our platform. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We convene leading global voices, conduct independent research, and engage the public in the discourse on critical global issues. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council. Our fall programming will focus mostly on the very important issues relevant to the 2016 presidential election in the U.S. And here are some highlights from our extensive programming season. On October 6th, we will host author Eric Schlosser, and this is just a newly added program, who will discuss the U.S. nuclear arsenal and the command and control structure of the arsenal. And that should be a really interesting event. On October 12th, we will host Chung Lee from the Brookings Institute, who will analyze the leadership transitions in the U.S. and China. And on October 13th, we will welcome Carolina Trivelli, who will deliver the annual Gus Hart Lecture on Peru at a Crossroads. We have a lot more programs on our website, so please check it and register online. And if you're not a council member, please consider joining. Generous support from our members and donors, people like you, makes all what we do possible, so thank you. Before we begin, please note that this event is on the record, so feel free to use social media, but please silence your phones. And we are also live streaming the event, and the video will be available online after the end of the program. I will return to the stage to moderate the Q&A. But before we start, I'd like to welcome to the stage to introduce our speaker, Ms. Ashley McCall. She's a valued member of the Directors Circle at the Council. So please join me in welcoming Ms. McCall.
Whoops. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ashley McCall, and on behalf of the Council, I would like to welcome all of you here tonight. This is a pretty profound, I think, moment to be discussing this subject, given what's happening internationally and certainly what's happening domestically. And I'm really honored to have the opportunity to introduce Paul Collier, where he will share his views on global migration and its implications. This topic is of personal importance to me. I can speak to the refugee crisis on a very micro level, not the macro level that he can. It has been an honor and a privilege to experience, as well as the trials and tribulations, to experience having resettled refugees and inviting them into my life, into my family's life, into my home to live. It has given me a very personal, human, and powerful understanding of the tremendous odds refugees face. Not only when they're fleeing for their lives, but also when they're resettled to the various countries that they're resettled to. Migration is having a profound impact on our world right now. We've seen the European Union face staggering challenges as unprecedented numbers of migrants and refugees have arrived on their shores, and they're still struggling with it, as we know. Millions more in countries such as Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, which are generating huge political, economic, and social issues for them and pressures. Migration is not only playing a critical role in the international stage, but certainly here domestically. It is a hot button, as we know, and it is dominating our political landscape at the moment. So we will all have something to go home to tonight, probably, to watch. To define it as a complex issue would probably be an understatement of the greatest magnitude. But it will be interesting tonight to hear Professor Collier's perspective on this really relevant topic right now. I have a few things that I'd just like to mention about him. He is a professor of economics and public policy at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. He is also the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. He serves as an advisor to the IMF's Strategy and Policy Department and to the World Bank's Africa region. Previously, he served as director of the Research Development Department at the World Bank. He's authored multiple books, including Exodus. And according to The Economist, Paul Collier is one of the world's most thoughtful economists. His books consistently illuminate and provoke, Exodus is no exception. His writing has appeared in The Independent, The New York Times, The Financial Times, amongst many other publications. And now I would like to welcome him to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming. I have to say, once I realized what was going on tonight, I thought I'd be speaking to an empty room. Welcome. Perhaps this is the moment when you calm down before the awfulness of the reality. I'm not going to talk about Exodus as such, because over the summer I've just written a book on the refugee crisis. It's the first time I've spoken about it, so the talk will probably be quite ragged, but it's very much at the top of my mind. And the reason I did a book on refugees was because the last couple of years I've been working with the government of Jordan, which has faced on the front line of this refugee crisis, and they brought me in to say, what can we do? So the book is joint with Alex Betts, who's the director of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, which is the biggest refugee studies centre in the world, and it's called Refugee: Why the refugee system is broken. And no, it's not. Transforming a broken refugee system. Refuge transforming a broken refugee system. And what I want to talk about tonight is I want to try and persuade you that it's broken, but that actually the global refugee situation is entirely manageable. And the key step is going to be to unmuddle refugees from migration. Refugees and migrants are just routinely lumped together in one concept, and that is disastrous. The potential number of global migrants is enormous. There's at least 1 billion people in poor countries who would like to live in rich ones. It's a vast phenomenon which is going to play out for the next half century, with acute tensions all over the place. There's no simple solutions to migration issues. I'm happy to talk about it at questions, but the central proposition tonight is that if we distinguish refugees sharply from migrants, at the moment there are only 20 million refugees. There's about 40 million internally displaced people, but those numbers are entirely manageable by the global community. There are very practical things that we can do, and it shouldn't be a divisive issue at all. It's become a very divisive issue, polarized into basically, are you a good person or a bad person? But it doesn't need to be. Everybody, I believe, can agree on the need to do something for refugees. The question is, what do we have to do? So, first, let me disentangle refugees from migrants. And it's actually very, very clear once you turn your mind to that. First, there are going to be four differentiating features. Right? But let's start with the most obvious, that people who become refugees are not doing it from choice. They are fleeing. What's forcing that flight is force majeure. And the force majeure applies not just to an individual, but to a group. Right? A whole group of people, maybe you're living in an area which has become, where there's a threat of mass violence, social order is broken down, or there's a threat of mass starvation. Your family's in danger either of being killed or of starving. And so you move. We would all move in that situation. It's not a choice, it's force majeure. Migration, in contrast, is a choice. People are saying, I'd like to leave this place, live elsewhere. The drivers are consequently, the motivational drivers are quite different. What's driving refuge, the flight to refuge, is basically fear. Refugees have in common that they're scared. Whereas migration is an act of hope. So, two very sharply differentiated things. And then there's a moral distinction. That what are people fleeing to or hoping for? Refugees are basically seeking havens. They're seeking safety. Whereas migrants traveling in hope are seeking a quantum improvement in life. If you want, it's going to be a distinction between havens and honeypots. Right? Now, in case you think that's crass, and that really refugees and migrants are seeking the same thing, try and think of the top few honeypot countries, the places that an aspiring migrant might want to go to. They wake up in the morning and decide, right, had enough of this, want to go, more hopeful place, where shall I go? One definitely will be here. But draw up in your mind a list of the top honeypot countries, and then let's turn to the top haven countries. Anybody want to guess what the top haven country in the world is for refugees? We've got Germany, we've got Sweden, Britain. You're all completely wrong. It's Pakistan. Pakistan. Number two, a close second, Iran. All the top 10 haven countries, which is where a majority of the world's refugees are, all of them are countries of net emigration. Right? They're not places that are super hopeful, where migrants are saying, let's go to Pakistan, right? Let alone, let's go to Iran, right? Why on earth are refugees going to them then? Right? Have they got weird ideas of hope? Or are these, is Pakistan and Iran particularly generous and welcoming to refugees? No, right? They are relatively safe environments in deeply disturbed regions. They are proximate to violence, disorder, chaos. And one of the things that refugees most concerned about in the flight to safety is it close? So that finally, let's turn to what the moral response is to the appropriate moral response to the flight for refuge and to the the hopeful desire for a quantum improvement in life, refuge and migration. To my mind, there's no ambiguity when we look at refuge. Somebody who is fleeing through force majeure, probably with their family, that places on everybody else a duty of rescue. You know, in philosophical terms, this is equivalent to your walking along by a pond and there's a child drowning in the pond. And what's your moral duty? You know, your moral duty is to get the child out of the pond. And that is the same with the duty towards refugees. Right? There is a duty of rescue. Right? And that's not something you can duck. Right? You can't say, sorry, I've just put a suit on because I'm about to go and address an audience and I don't want to spoil it, you know, so I can't jump in. Right? The duty of rescue overrides inconvenience. You've just got to meet that duty. Right? We don't have anything like an equivalent moral obligation towards people who want a quantum improvement in their lives. Right? We can choose to do it, but there is clearly no moral right to live any way you want. Right? There never has been, and it's hard to see why there ever should be. Though I'm happy to return to that in questions. So the moral obligation to action is very much sharper for refugees than it is for the vastly bigger number of migrants, would-be migrants. So what is the moral, what's the content of the duty of rescue? And again, it's very different from meeting the hopes of migrants, because the duty of rescue, basically, pulling the child out of the pond, what's the equivalent with a family fleeing violence? The equivalent is restoration of normality. The purpose of flight is not take me to California. The purpose of flight is get my family and myself back to circumstances which make normal life as near to possible as you can manage. Right? So that's why we need to disentangle refuge from migration. And now I'm going to briefly discuss why the Syria refugee crisis has become a crisis. And it's a mixture of two terrible things. One is that the system, by the time of the Syria crisis, the international system for dealing with refugees was hopelessly broken. Hopelessly broken. Not even retrievably broken. Right? And secondly, the political response to that refugee crisis was a disgrace. Right? It was short-term populist response. So let me take those two. The system, the international system for refugees. Right? The international system actually was put in place in the late 1940s as two pillars, an institution, UNHCR, and a legal structure, a convention. And both are completely unfit for purpose. So we'll take UNHCR. Right? UNHCR is the only UN agency with a monopoly mandate. If it has refugees in it, it has to be handled by UNHCR. There's no other UN agency which has a monopoly. Monopoly is always bad, but it's particularly bad in this case because UNHCR has one disastrous feature, which is that it's a purely humanitarian agency. And its mission is defined essentially from the circumstances of the late 1940s, all those refugees in Eastern Europe, and what they needed in the late 1940s, they were in transit, they needed temporary food, temporary shelter. And so UNHCR evolved into an institution which provided food and shelter for refugees. Does it in camps. The modern refugee is not in transit. They're typically refugees for years. And so the emergency response of we'll feed you, we'll house you, is completely inadequate to the needs of refugees. Consequently, only a small minority of refugees ever interface with UNHCR. In Syria, the vast majority of Syrian refugees have completely bypassed UNHCR and receive nothing from it. Why? Because their priority is not food and shelter. It's the dignity of being able to earn a living for their family. And so they go to towns. They're not allowed to work in towns because it's not part of the package. But in a town, you can get below the radar screen and work illegally. Because it's illegal, it's lousy, but at least you have the dignity of earning a living, feeding your family that way, rather than being on 10 years of welfare in a camp. Right? Now, the priority, the overwhelming priority in dealing with refugees is to get an economic interface to actually provide proper work for refugees. That's what I was doing in Jordan. And we came up with a package which the government, and there has to be something in it, obviously, for the haven countries. Because why were people not allowed to work in Jordan or in any of the other haven countries? Because the haven governments saw it as a threat to their own citizens. There aren't enough jobs for Jordanians, let alone for the refugees. And so what the package is let's bring in jobs, new jobs, into industrial zones, in the case of Jordan, and let's make those jobs, let's split them up. Some of the jobs will be for refugees, some will be for Jordanians. And on that basis, the government of Jordan said, okay, then refugees can work. In fact, they've offered to create 200,000 work permits for Syrian refugees in Jordan, as long as jobs come in. So the task now is get those jobs in. UNHCR has no competence whatsoever in that field because it is not an economic agency. The relevant agency within America is actually the International Finance Corporation, which deals with firms and could use public money to incentivize firms to take jobs into the camps. Britain has pioneered doing that. For example, one of the biggest supermarket chains has now, the business secretary, the government minister responsible for business, flew a load of executives to industrial zones in Jordan and said, what can you do? And one of the big supermarket chains placed a load of orders with firms in Jordan, conditional upon a lot of those jobs created being for refugees. So that's what needs to happen. UNHCR is totally unequipped to deal with it. As I say, it's a humanitarian agency, and within that it's focused on the wrong things, food and shelter. The legal entity, the convention, is, if anything, even more unfit for purpose. It's just not appropriate for the modern situation. The convention comes out of 1948, and it's a very early instrument of America at the onset of the Cold War. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, America and Britain had the very painful task of returning people who didn't want, Hungarians who didn't want to go back to Hungary. Part of the peace deal with the Soviet Union was, okay, they'll all be sent back. By 1948, it was clear that Eastern Europe was falling into the hands of these communist regimes, and so America, very rightly, didn't want to be forced to return refugees who'd fled out of these communist regimes. They didn't want to be required to return them. And that's what the convention was about. It was about if a person was persecuted by his government, then there was no duty of return. Yeah? Very sensible. At the time, it was recognized that this was very particular circumstances. And so the convention was time limited. It wouldn't apply to anybody who was a refugee after January 1950, and it wouldn't apply outside Europe. So it couldn't have been clearer that it was about a very specific situation. Guess what? It's still there. Right? And in 1967, in a classic piece of Eurocentricism, Europe declared that it was not a European policy, it was global. Right? They just forgot to tell anybody. That most refugees, first of all, they are now a group phenomenon. They're not being persecuted by a government. It's not individuals persecuted by a government. It's groups of people fleeing violence and hunger. So they don't meet the definitions. For many, many years, Germany refused to give asylum to Somalis because Somalis weren't being persecuted by a government. Very simple reason, there wasn't a government. Right? Ludicrous. Right? But the most ludicrous aspect of it all is that most refugees nowadays are in these 10 haven countries. None of them are signatories to this convention. Right? So it's just, it's being used for a purpose that it's not designed for. So it's just not work. It's not going to work. Right? It's not that we need a new convention or a new agency. We need a different approach that integrates economics. The challenge of how to respond to refugees needs to get out of courtrooms and into boardrooms. Right? It's the big companies that know how to make globalization work that should be using globalization to bring jobs and dignity to refugees. So that's the challenge. What does that mean in practice for our duty of rescue? The principles need to be solidarity and specialization according to comparative advantage. Let's have a look what actually happened in Europe as a result of the Syria crisis. Was there solidarity and was there specialization according to comparative advantage? Well, there was solidarity after a fashion. Nobody did anything. That's why I was called into Jordan, because the Syrians who became refugees fled, of course, to the proximate havens. They just fled across the borders. 10 million Syrians were displaced. Half of them are still in Syria. Right? Half of them couldn't get across borders. Right? But half got across borders, and they went to Turkey, to Jordan, to Lebanon. Now, these are not rich countries. They're not dirt poor countries, but they're not rich. Take Jordan, about 1 million refugees. Its own population is less than 10 million, so this is a big shock, right? A big shock. At the time when it started, 2011, the Jordanian government was in good economic order. It had debt to GDP around 65–70%. It was left to hang out to dry. It had to finance this, and so debt exploded. It had to borrow commercially in order to fund this. I asked my friends in the World Bank, I said, where's the World Bank in all this? Why aren't you helping? And the answer was, oh, we can't. We can't because Jordan is an upper middle income country, so we're out of it. But there's 1 million refugees from a conflict country. Oh, once Syria becomes post-conflict, we'll have big money for post-conflict Syria. But there's no money for the refugees whilst they're in Jordan. They just count as Jordan. Right? This is obviously crazy. Right? Fortunately, pressure was brought and they've changed. Right? The rules have changed. So the World Bank can now belatedly be in Jordan. But until late last year, our international economic organizations just sat on their hands and watched. And European governments sat on their wallets and didn't finance the neighboring havens. Well, they financed on a small-scale emergency basis, and of course you soon get bored with emergencies. And so in 2014, the Germans halved their payment to UNHCR for the Syrian refugees in Jordan. When I talked with the UNHCR in Syria, they said, as a result of this, we're just going to have to cut the food package. So these incredibly short-sighted and selfish responses, not recognizing the duty of rescue. It's what I call the response of the heartless head. And then suddenly, in the summer of 2015, we flipped from the policies of the heartless head to the policies of the headless heart. Come to Germany. Come to Germany. No means of getting to Germany. The only means of getting to Germany was to buy a place from a people trafficker on a leaky boat. Right? So something like 3,000 people drowned in the process. It's terrible. But there's an even more long-term nightmare, and this comes from, let's try and think long-term. It's very hard during a conflict to believe that it will ever end. But one of the things I've specialized on is civil wars and conflicts, and they end. Right? They do not go on forever. Right? Typical duration is sort of 7 to 15 years, depending on how you count. The conflict in Syria will end. It will then be a destroyed society which has to rebuild. Okay? At that stage, there'll be a lot of money pushed in. But money isn't the only thing that post-conflict recovery needs. Post-conflict recovery needs organizational capital, and it needs human capital. Post-conflict recovery is, to a considerable extent, about rebuilding the government bureaucracy and rebuilding firms so that they can create jobs. Potentially, you could do all that even before the conflict ends. You could incubate post-conflict during the conflict. So if you can bring firms to Jordan during the conflict, when the conflict ends, they can set up operations as the refugees go back to Syria. They can set up operations in Syria. Potentially, just as the industrial zones can attract firms from the West, they can also be havens for Syrian firms. Imagine being the main industrial center in Syria is Aleppo, which is being bombed to bits. So there are a lot of firms that could move out of Syria and be incubated or protected just as individuals are protected. They need a safe haven. And preferably one that has a legal framework and finance and so on that enables them to stay in business. So there's a lot of scope to incubate the post-conflict recovery so it works better. But let's return to the headless heart. The flow of refugees into Germany. And it sounded a brave and noble thing to do, and politically it was very brave. At least it became very brave. It was very popular for a month. But think who are the refugees who are most likely to move? You've got to take a big risk, get in a leaky boat. You've got to have big money. Place in a leaky boat costs on average about $6,000. Average annual income in Syria, even before the conflict, was $2,000. So we're talking about wealthy people willing to take risks. Basically, well-off young men. If we look at the survey evidence, UNHCR does a good job in the neighboring havens of trying to get a profile of the demographic characteristics of who's a refugee. It basically turns out to be a random sample of the Syrian population, which is not surprising if it's not a choice. Right? This is force majeure, and so randomly some people are having to flee. Just a representative sample of the Syrian population. But the people in Germany, the Syrians in Germany, are very far from being a representative sample of the Syrian population. Something under 5% of the Syrian population is now in Germany. But something between a third and a half of all the Syrians with a university education are now in Germany. That's a lot. Now, hopefully, those highly educated Syrians will go back when the conflict's over, because they will most surely be needed. Rebuilding a broken country requires the educated people who can rebuild a bureaucracy and manage the firms that are going to create the jobs. If that is the priority, then what should Germany's strategy be? It should basically be to preserve contacts with the rest of the Syrian population, basically not integrate people into Germany, keep the communities intact and so on. What's Germany actually doing? I was there last week. What they're actually doing is, of course, prioritizing integration by dispersing the population around Germany, breaking communities up, training them in German, because for domestic political reasons, there's now been a great backlash, and so the whole message is, oh, you know, we're going to integrate these people. These people are going to become Germans. Yeah? What's being forgotten in this is the 19 million Syrians who will still be in Syria when the conflict ends. So, why are we in such a catastrophic situation? Because we have a completely broken refugee system, an agency that cannot respond economically, and a convention that is designed for persecuted individuals rather than mass flight from force majeure. We've got institutions that are hopeless, and we've got political responses that just lurch between heartless head, headless heart. Of course, Europe is now back with a vengeance to heartless head. Right? Send them back to Turkey. Right? That deal between Merkel and Erdogan had one final awful consequence. And that is that, if you remember the deal, it was that Erdogan would get €6 billion and a load of political nice things like visa-free travel to Europe for Turks in return for not expelling Syrian refugees, basically, and for taking some back. That inadvertently became an international lesson. And the international lesson learned was that that potentially refugees can be used as hostages. And so, sure enough, within about a month of that deal, an African country with a lot of refugees said, oh, we're changing our policy. We're expelling the refugees. And of course, the donors said, please don't do that. And the government said, it'll cost you. And so, sure enough, the donors reached into their wallets and wrote the checks that they ought to have written, not under that sort of duress. But the lesson learned was that refugees can become a bargaining tool. Right? So, inadvertently, we've reached an awful place. And so it is really time for a rethink. That's what the book's calling for. As we say at the end of the book, and I do urge you to read it, not because I want to sell the book, but because I want to change international refugee policy. What we say at the end of the book is, okay, we've done our part. We've shown you what's wrong. We've shown you what could be a future. We can't make it happen politically. You collectively can. Please do. Thank you.
We have time for some questions now. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will call on you and wait for the microphone. And please make sure your question is a question and not a comment. We have one all the way in the back.
Thank you. My name is Kathleen Bush-Joseph, and I work with a nonprofit in Benin. I'm curious about your take on the international legal framework, because it seems that since it's inconvenient, we can set it aside and then see the implications in the game theory with the negotiation, as you were speaking about with Turkey and then with Kenya. So I'm hoping that you could remark on how you would like to see the international refugee framework change from a legal perspective, or if not, how we can go about working with what it is.
Yeah, it's a good question. Alex Betts and I have agonized over this, and I suppose we've reached the conclusion that once you start the basic point is that it was never meant to deal with the sort of refugee situations we've now got. Mass flight from disorder and hunger. It just wasn't designed for that. And so we should recognize it's designed for a specific feature, which is individuals persecuted by governments. That still happens, but it's a small minority of refugees. And so we should use it for that. It's not a useless convention, but it's a convention that's designed for that. Quite obviously, if none of the 10 governments that have the refugees are signatories to it, it's not relevant to the majority of refugee circumstances. What we desperately need to get to is not, and it's going to be got to not by laws forcing governments to do what they don't want to do. That is, I think, a pretty forlorn hope. What needs to happen is the sort of thing we've managed to pull off in Jordan, is constructing approaches which are mutually advantageous for refugees and for the host governments, because they bring benefits both to the citizens of the haven countries and to the refugees themselves. If we work on packages that are mutually advantageous, we will get cooperation from governments and from their populations. If we just try and do it by individual legal rights, there's no way of coping with 20 million refugees, and behind that, the 40 million displaced people. One of the reasons there are so many displaced people still in Syria is because the haven countries were left out to dry, they closed their borders. And so the displaced couldn't get across those borders. So it's a vital matter that the haven countries, their governments and their peoples, are offered approaches which don't coerce them into doing things they don't want to do, but which meet their aspirations and along the way provide for refugees. So I want to move from a model of legal coercion to one of mutual advantage. And the problem is small enough that it is entirely affordable. This is not big money on the scale of things.
Okay, one question in the back over there. Yeah, the lady by the door.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shaska Chirinos. Thank you for your thought-provoking comments. In June of this year, President Obama set forth the call to action, which encourages the private sector to enable education, career development, and sustainability for the refugees. Do you think this is the best way companies can create an impact? And if not, what route should they take? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm very hopeful that President Obama has embraced this issue so powerfully, indeed as his sort of legacy initiative. And I think it's absolutely right that he's taking it to boardrooms and saying to companies, this is not something you can park under your corporate social responsibility division and send blankets. You should be doing your core business, but doing your core business in places you've not thought of. Yeah? Now, the difficulty with President Obama's approach, and it's understandable why it is as it is that at the moment, it's fundamentally, it's sort of exhortation, it's a wake-up call to companies. Now, that's a very good thing to do, and it does help companies to know that other companies will be exhorted at the same time, and so everybody will be potentially moving to these places together. That's less scary. But there is an irreducible need to match that exhortation with public money. And for understandable reasons, President Obama's had difficulties. Basically, he knows that he can't get proposals for public money through Congress. Right? Other countries don't face that difficulty. They can actually do a joined-up approach of exhorting business and matching it with public money that finances the public interest component of what firms will be doing. And that seems to me very appropriate. Refugees who are refugees for, say, 7 years obviously need a job. It will cost money to provide those jobs. But it's consistent with the dignity of being a refugee for those 7 years. And it's much cheaper than having them on welfare for 7 years. So it's both, it makes financial sense to use some public money to pump prime the process of generating work opportunities. So President Obama's initiative I absolutely commend, but it needs to be matched with the money.
You have one question, one here.
Professor, could you explain in your opinion why you think there's been a political backlash against refugees?
Yeah, it's, thank you for asking that. And it is a catastrophically sad, more than sad, disastrous consequence of such a mishandled situation. Because if you think about it, the main resource on which refugees ought to be able to rely is our compassion. The child falls into the pond. It doesn't scream from the pond, "I demand my rights." It screams, "Help." Right? And just as that child, refugees who flee violence and hunger need to be confident that they evoke a compassion which will roll up its sleeves and be effective. And disastrously, certainly in Europe, the situation has been so mishandled that refugees now evoke not compassion, but fear. And Europe is now doing things that place refugees in that category of something to be feared. You know, where belatedly the European Union, which my country is just leaving, the European Union has decided it wants to have a big program of financial support in Africa. Very welcome. It stinks because written all over it is, we don't want you to come here. Right? That is absolutely no basis for sitting down with an African government and saying, what can we do to help? Right? Obviously, my whole working life has been devoted to the premise that these societies need to catch up with us. Right? And they need to be helped in that process of catch-up. But not because we're scared of them coming here. Right? And so we've got ourselves into a situation where both refugees and the people who are becoming would-be migrants out of a loss of hope in their own societies are feared, and so we're going to start reaching into our wallets. That's the right action, completely the wrong motivations, and the dreadful motivations will contaminate and make much more difficult the task that that money should be achieving.
Question over there in third row.
Hasn't the U.S. foreign policy sort of created the situation already, like with Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, in the first place?
You know, I want to sort of back off the sort of who's to blame, not because there aren't answers, but because it misses the point, really. The point of the duty of, the child is in the pond. Do we only pull the child out of the pond because our government pushed it in? We get the child out of the pond regardless of what got it in the pond. Right? The child is not shouting, I fell in because you made the path slippery or something. It's just shouting help. Right? And so the reason why we should respond to refugees is independent of what caused the situation. And if we look at what caused the situations, American response has been very, very different. Afghanistan, I believe President Obama called it a war of necessity. Syria, Iraq clearly wasn't a war of necessity. Libya, America didn't want to intervene. That was where the phrase came, let's lead from behind, which is a imaginative use of language. And Syria, America didn't intervene at all. So there's actually a range of, I'm wary of the idea that America's to blame for everything. But I come back to the larger issue is that for refugees, it doesn't matter what caused it. A lot of the flight to refuge is a flight due to hunger. Now, if the crops fail and people flee across a border, who are we going to blame? Are we going to blame God? I mean, it doesn't matter, right? We've got to do something about it. We've got to respond to the need for refuge regardless of what caused it.
Second row here, please.
Hi. Professor Collier, what's the name of your book, your latest book, and is it already available?
Well, it sure isn't. So it's with the publishers, and there are several. I think in America it's Oxford University Press, in Britain it's Penguin, and it's being translated as we speak. So it's not out yet, and it's called Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System.
And we have one in the back over there.
And it's designed to change, to ignite a change in global policy. We're very careful not to provide a detailed blueprint of this is what it should look like, because that is both arrogant and doomed to failure, right? But we do suggest a path, a direction that should be taken. And the direction, I'll just sketch that it involves lots of actors. It's not, we need a new global refugee agency, right? The days of single monopoly agencies are over, right? We need a much more decentralized response of lots of different actors, all doing what they can do best and aligning around a different objective.
Great. Please.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. So I want to extend on that gentleman's question, but from a different perspective. So one thing I feel incredibly confused is the way people are talking about refugee crisis as if it's a natural disaster, but it's not. It's a direct effect of a series of well-crafted policies carried out and worked out by supposedly super smart people. And so in this sense, it's not unlike financial crisis. So after something happened, almost the same group of super smart people come out and ask the public to pay the bill. Would it be nice if the public can hear, before they pay, can hear some explanation, some acknowledgement, and if not, God forbids, an apology? Would that be nice?
Yeah.
What do you think? Thank you.
I agree with quite a bit of that. I did a piece in the Financial Times last week, which ended with, I think, the line, "We need a chorus from politicians of mea culpa." Yeah? Basically, I got it wrong. So where I would quibble with you is to say this is the result of people who are super smart. I don't see super smart anywhere in this refugee landscape. What I see is neglect. The international refugee system is the only part, as far as we can see, it is the only part of the post-war international architecture that has not been reformed, ever. And if you think about it, the macro financial system of Bretton Woods hit crisis in 1971 and was completely revised. Right? Trade completely changed with the move from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to the World Trade Organization. Every area you look of international architecture, post-war international architecture, has been modernized as the world has changed, except this. And it's not because the world hasn't changed. The refugee struggle, the refugee situation is radically different from what it was in the late 1940s. The number of refugees is at a post-1945 all-time high. So this is not a problem that's going away anytime soon. The number of fragile states is so high that there'll be a constant flow of disorder and flight to refuge for the foreseeable future. We need to get a coherent response, but what we witnessed was prolonged neglect and then populist folly, this lurch between the heartless head and the headless heart and back to the heartless head with nothing in between. We need heart with refugees, but it should be a natural thing. This is not, we don't need saints to deal with refugees. We need the ordinary human compassion that would lead 99% of mankind to jump in the pond to rescue that child. We don't need exceptional goodness. Right? We don't need the saints. We need ordinary human compassion. We can all agree on this. We'll never agree on migration. Right? My grandchildren will still be arguing about it when they're old people, right? But we can all agree on what we need to do about refugees, but we're not doing it. Right? Instead, it's become contaminated by this polarized debate. So we've had neglect followed by folly. Right? So I don't see super smart anywhere in the site. Right?
Phil?
Thank you. Phil Levy with the Chicago Council. I wanted to come back to the question of assimilation and what you described in Germany's move in this. This seems to me quite difficult, and I realize you're not putting forward a precise blueprint, but if I heard you right, you talked about civil wars on average being in the 7 to 15-year range. That's rather a long time to keep a group within an enclave, even if you are sort of providing them with jobs. How do you envision how do you strike that balance between letting them be citizens or proper residents of a country?
It's a very good question, and we do deal with that issue head on in the book, and I'm not had time, so let me sketch it now. Let's take two polar extremes, right? The conflict ends a month after you become a refugee and get asylum in California or whatever. Have you got the right to stay in California for life? You know, you're the guy with the doctorate, and your country needs rebuilding, and you've only been there a month. Hard to see that refugee status should give you the right to a golden ticket. That's 1 month. Other end of the spectrum, the conflict ends after 50 years. You've been in California 50 years. Should you suddenly be sent back? Obviously not. Right? So we've anchored it at each end of the spectrum. 1 month, no right. 50 years, absolute right to stay. Right? 2 months, 49 years. If you think about it, there is no obvious point at which we can all say, it must be there. Right? It's a continuum. But we know that somewhere along that continuum, policy needs to change from you're going back to you're staying here. Right? And the rights accordingly. Right? Now, here's the key proposition we put forward. Wherever you draw that line, it's going to be arbitrary. But it's important to draw it. You don't have to have the same line in every situation. You could have different lines in different regions, but it's very useful to have a line and to know what that line is right at the beginning. Because suppose we draw the line at, say, 7 years. Then you become a refugee, and the clock starts ticking. And your decision problem is, will this conflict still be going on in 7 years? Right? Now, that's a genuine aspect of uncertainty, but knowing that it's a 7-year horizon, you can shape your life accordingly. For the first couple of years, you probably think, well, this conflict will end, and so I'm going to basically focus on preserving my contacts, saving some money so that I can go back and do something. By year 5, you might well have revised to think, actually, we're going to be staying here. I better learn the language properly. I better start to break into the social networks that are here. And that's a sensible sequence. Right? We don't know the future. The best thing we can do is respond intelligently to the updating flow of information. And to do that, we need a clear line. It will be an arbitrary line, but clarity right from the beginning helps everybody. So that's where we come down to in the book. So of course there must be a right to stay after a certain time, of course. Yeah? I've talked about the need to go back because it's the forgotten need. Right? The right of people who are here, their needs and their rights have sort of very much to the forefront of attention. But we've got to recognize that sometimes these people are the elite of their society, and so we should be wary of giving them permanence too quickly, I think.
Okay, over here on the side, please.
Thank you. To me, everything you've said made sense, but my question is, the investments into the haven countries seem to fall into the realm of social responsibilities of the corporate, not the business decision-making process. So if that is the case, fine. If not, what would be the incentive for the corporates to invest?
Yeah. So it's a good question. That's why we need some public money to support at least the initial costs of firms going to places that they'd rather not go to. Right? Indeed, let me sort of, we're probably drawing to a close, but the need for business in refugee havens is part of a rather larger class of need for business in the sort of countries I work on most of the time, fragile states around the world, where they're desperately short of reputable firms doing the sort of thing that reputable firms know how to do, making ordinary people much more productive. And these are not honeypot environments for firms. There's very good reason why firms are reluctant to go there. But unless they go there, fragile states are likely to stay fragile for a very long time. And so public money has to be used to reduce the costs and bear some of the risks for when private firms move their business into difficult environments. So it has to be incentivized. Now, it's not just a matter of we'll bribe firms to go to places they don't want to go. There is a mission side to this, and that's what President Obama quite rightly appealed to. The people who work in big successful businesses are often looking for a meaning larger than just increasing the bottom line. They've got a set of skills and they want to put them to good use for people who are desperately short of opportunities. I came across one of the really huge investment banks which set up a very small social enterprise unit, 4 people, and it wondered whether it could fill those 4 positions. No bonus and that sort of thing. So they advertised it within the firm to see whether anybody would be interested. 1,000 people applied from within the firm. Right? And what that showed was a depth of very decent people in very fine organizations wanting to put their skills to some larger purpose. Right? That is not a license for businesses to commit financial suicide. They quite rightly have responsibilities to shareholders and employees, but it is something that public money can actually take the sting out. And so a fine business can both reconcile its bottom line and give its employees a sense of higher purpose by meeting these unmet needs in poor societies. And let's start with refugees. Sorry.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So please join me in thanking Professor Collier.